and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. Wow. Of course, this is widely recognized as a fraudulent insertion. Every scholar worthy of the name recognizes that it is impossible for this passage to be genuine. Flavius Josephus was a commander in the First Jewish War against Rome from 66 to 73 CE, but was later captured and switched sides, providing Rome with useful tactical insights and cultural contexts, for which, of course, he is forever denounced by Jews as a traitor. And understandably so. In his other writings, Josephus names the Roman Emperor Vespasian as the fulfillment of the messianic hopes of the Jews. One of many reasons why scholars recognize the testimonium as a contradiction and thus a forgery. The other reason is that we have 300 years of commentary by other church fathers who read and argued from Josephus to prove Jesus and never noticed this love letter. And if you want more details, there will be further discussions in the future on that topic. There are other references in the 2nd century and beyond, but all of them are too late to give contemporary evidence of Jesus, or have been challenged by historians, only providing evidence that Christians exist. And there will be more details on these other reports in future discussions. You can just corner me later if you want to know more. What is interesting about Josephus is that he does give other references to other messiahs, failed messiahs, some of whom are corroborated by others. In the Jewish War, Josephus mentions 10 failed messiahs, not including John the Baptist, who is corroborated, but has no connection to anyone named Jesus. The other men mentioned are failures, but they do follow a pattern, preaching that God's kingdom is at hand, and that people should follow them. So typically there's a pattern that emerges. Roman soldiers show up and kill everyone involved, time after time. For example, Simon of Perea was a failed usurper mentioned by Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus. He changed nothing. He simply got himself killed. It's a pattern that keeps repeating itself. Roman soldiers show up and kill everyone involved, time after time. And there are others. The impostor, the Egyptian, Athronges the shepherd, Theudas the magician, Judas of Galilee, no, not that Judas, the restorer, Jonathan the weaver. Failed rabble-rousers that try to whip up a following among the Jews, only to get themselves slaughtered in a series of Roman crackdowns. All failures. Every time, Roman soldiers show up and kill everyone involved, time after time. All failures, with one exception. These men still managed to get noticed by a historian living in the 1st century, a feat Jesus of Nazareth could not accomplish. But there is an anomaly. Yeshua ben Ananias. He is described as a very ordinary yokel who one day decides to become an apocalyptic prophet. So he screams night and day in the streets about how the world is soon to be destroyed. And that didn't go over so well. He is beaten to a pulp by an irate audience and brought before the authorities for questioning. Yeshua is sentenced to be scourged until his flesh hung in ribbons. Josephus is explicit that he says nothing in his own defense. You know what that sounds like? Mark 15, verse 5. Was this an inspiration for the Gospels? So, historians trying to sort this out have a problem. How is it that we have evidence of these failures that amounted to nothing, yet the most famous and successful of all is missing? Why? So maybe Jesus was just really, really obscure, but then he would have to be more obscure than a very ordinary yokel? And if he was so obscure, why was he worshipped by a string of house cults soon after his death? To answer this question, we must go back to the earliest true source, to see what the secular writers missed. That means we need to go to the earliest Christian documents. The epistles of Paul. Yes, at some point we will indeed need to use the Bible, but with a few assumptions. All good Christians I talk to tell me that I'm taking everything out of context and that I don't have the right spirit. Well, none of them can agree among themselves what the correct spirit is, but I can tell you what my assumptions are. Since Paul precedes the Gospels, I assert that our standard starting point, that Paul refers to the canonical Gospels, is not a given and must be justified. Let's look deeper. Now, certain liberal scholars have noted an unusual trend if you consider the authentic epistles of Paul as a whole. His Jesus is never clearly put into any geographic setting. In fact, considering the genuine epistles, Paul's Jesus is actually never on earth at all. How can that be? It's shocking. But bear with me. By authentic epistles, I refer to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, Galatians, and Romans. All the others have been challenged by critical scholars for either stylistic differences or content that could not have come from the same writer as these 7. So, a surprising pattern emerges in these genuine articles. Jesus never actually lives on earth and is never heard from until after his resurrection. That's impossible, the fundamentalist declares. Is it? There is no mention of Mary, Joseph, Nazareth, the Word disciples, or a preaching ministry for Jesus in these authentic letters. Some apologists know this, and they argue that Paul simply had no interest in Jesus' earthly life, only his resurrection. But this is demonstrably false, as we'll see. Paul is arguing with other Christians over topics Jesus has supposedly already ruled on. Consider Romans 13, 6 through 7. There's a controversy about Christians paying taxes to Rome. Paul gives us not a word about Jesus' pithy aphorism to render under Caesar from Mark 12, 14 to 17. Could he not know? Or when Paul says to expel fornicators in your midst and abandon them to the devil in 1 Corinthians 5, well, here's a chance to mention how Jesus said to cut off body parts that offend you rather than burn in hell, as in Matthew 27 through 30. But he never mentions these stories from a Jesus on earth. Or the time when Paul is giving a discourse on meat sacrificed to idols in 1 Corinthians 8:8, telling Christians not to let others stumble by example. Well, here is a perfect opportunity to mention Mark 7:15, where Jesus says that nothing that goes into a man can defile him. Or the big circumcision controversy, like in 1 Corinthians 7:18 to 19. So over the course of 5 chapters in the book of Romans, Paul is arguing with the circumcision party and explaining how it doesn't matter. However, he seems blissfully unaware of what it says in Luke 2:21, how Jesus was circumcised. His enemies could have thrown that in his face to win any argument. Jesus' example must be authoritative. He never has to address that. He never has to explain how, even though Jesus was circumcised, we don't have to be, and here's why. That never comes up. It's as if this detail is not known in any traditional form before Luke was written. Jesus already ruled on these issues, but Paul doesn't know that. If early Christians didn't care about Jesus' life, then whence come the Gospels? But there are more problems. Romans 8:26. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our infirmities, for we do not know how to pray as we ought, but that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. Poetic, but strange. Shouldn't there have been some oral tradition about the Lord's Prayer? Starting from Luke 11, verse 1. He was praying in a certain place, and after he had finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray." And Jesus goes on with the Lord's Prayer. How strange that Paul would say that Christians don't know how to pray. Maybe not so strange if we recognize that Paul simply didn't know this story. Here, it's easier to hypothesize that the canonical Gospels are built out of Paul's teachings on church controversies rather than the other way around. But we're not done yet. Adding fuel to the fire, it appears that there are places where Paul seems to be denying the deeds of Jesus on earth. 1 Corinthians 1, 22-23. For the Jews require a sign and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block and unto the Greeks foolishness. Okay, so for the Jews, why not tell stories of Lazarus, or maybe Jairus' daughter? For the Greeks, hit him with something from the Beatitudes. But Paul doesn't do that. As if he doesn't know of any miracles or wisdom given when Jesus was on earth. Here's something else that most Christians just ignore. Romans 10:14. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? Wait a sec. The only one Paul wants people to believe in is Jesus. This verse seems to be literally saying that the Jews have not heard of Jesus. Well, think about that. If they cannot believe in him whom they have not heard, doesn't that mean that they haven't heard of Jesus? And they need an apostle to preach to them? Well, this has alarming implications. Didn't Jesus just get done preaching a few years ago in Galilee? But Paul thinks no Jew or Greek had the chance to hear about him. How could he think that if Jesus ever had a teaching ministry on earth? Or, consider Romans 13:3, where Paul says, "Rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil." A bit odd. Didn't all of Judea just witness the innocent Savior of mankind condemned in a sham trial to allow corrupt Jews to cling to their power? Strange that Paul would think that rulers are not a threat to the innocent. Baffling. But let's consider some rebuttals to this position. Some apologists will point to the Lord's Supper of 1 Corinthians 11, 23-25, William Lane Craig, and say that this was passed down directly from Jesus. Sounds good? Until you examine it more closely. For I have received of the Lord that which also I deliver unto you, that the Lord Jesus, in the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he brake it and said, Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And the same thing with a cup of wine. But let's pay attention to the context. Paul is complaining about the table manners of the Corinthians and says he just got this ritual from Jesus. Well, how can that be? If the Last Supper was a tradition known in the churches since the beginning, how can Paul be just giving this to them now? Something he just recently received from Jesus? If this were something the church had inherited, he could just remind them of Jesus' example that everyone should know about. Instead, he's offering this as new information. But it would make sense if the gospel accounts are borrowing from Paul to create the beloved tales of Jesus we all grow up with. But there's another problem. Scholars, for example historian Richard Carrier, among others, who read the Bible in the original languages, have noted something unusual. Where it says Jesus was betrayed, that word in Greek, paradidomini, is actually ambiguous. It actually means to simply deliver or offer up. Whereas in Romans 4:25, Jesus is simply delivered, so their sins can be forgiven. Same word in both cases, but modern translators use it differently. dishonestly in the case of the Lord's Supper. This is no doubt meant to remind us of Judas Iscariot, whom Paul nowhere mentions and displays no knowledge of. Another challenge raised by apologists is 1 Thessalonians 2. Now there is a place where Paul seems to acknowledge that Jesus